I'm Udwa Kamimo, and this is Fearless. Hanae Bezad is a change maker, entrepreneur, techie, speaker, poet, essayist, and now author. Her book, Being Other, The Beauty and Power of Being an Outsider, chronicles her experiences as a woman of African Arab origin in Morocco, navigating educational and professional experiences in Europe, America, and Africa. The book shares insights from other women with similar experiences and offers exercises for the reader to process and make sense of their own journey and identities. When she's not roaming the world sharing her gifts, Hanae works as a consultant through her company, Bihan. Hanae is my guest on Fearless. Hello and welcome, Hanae.
Thank you so much, Edouard. It's my pleasure to be here today.
So, Hanae, I'll begin with a question you ask us in the book to ask ourselves, which is, what is essential about you?
Ooh, I get goosebumps already. What's essential about me? I would say my outlook on the world, my sensitivity, my appreciation of the smaller things. Things like going to a TV studio yesterday and noticing the flowers and the bee moving around, noticing the colors in the sky despite the skyscrapers surrounding me. I'm in Toronto now. Noticing the temperature and people walking and the crowd and its movements. So I'd say this is very essential about me. Just like having the capacity or the willingness to look into people's eyes. And again, I'm in Toronto now and it's a big city and everyone's rushing and it's a hustle culture. Such a contrast with Hawaii, right? Where I was a few days ago. And yet I'd like to see people's gentleness and kindness and small gestures into welcoming you into space and showing up for you in the most delicate way. This is essential about me. What's essential about me as well is my care for the planet and the people. I wake up every day thinking, how will I show up today to my people, to my endeavor right now. So I'm on the tail end of my book tour. And it's a lot of holding space, having important conversations, giving, essentially. And so how do I make this beautiful and substantial? Yeah.
The book is interesting and resonates deeply with me, and I guess it would resonate with all of us who have multiple intersecting identities and have worked across contexts, cultures, continents. But let's start with you. And you tell us in the book that your early years are spent in Morocco. You tell us about your lineage with one of your grandfathers having fought in World War II and that difficulty, colonialism, France. And then you end up in France yourself. And you say very clearly, like your grandfather, fighting battles that are not yours. What experiences in your early years impacted how you see yourself as a woman, as an Arab, as a Muslim, as an African, to bring together in this book?
Mm-hmm. So my grandfather actually fought for World War I, but it's funny that you said World War II because for the longest time I thought he fought for the two wars. It was a bit confusing to hear my mother talk about him, and then over time, I kind of understood she had to protect herself because she felt really distant from him. He was very traumatized. And I'd say in my form...
He was traumatized by the war.
He was traumatized by the war, and my mom was traumatized from having a dad that was traumatized by the war, that would wake up at night from nightmares and be distant to her, I mean, it's that culture. My mom was born in the 50s, and she grew up with older brothers and her father in a rather traditional context. And so she did her best to create a different culture in our family. My dad had 3 daughters and we were really close. And so she was also sharing her thoughts on mothering and parenting with me as a child. And so I was really close to her and I would receive a lot of her insights and understand her worldview very early on. being the youngest of a family of 3 daughters, my closest sister was 7 years older than me, and the other one was 14 years older than me. So I had to kind of, I want to say catch up, but not really, because I was, both my sisters petitioned for my coming to the world. And so there was a lot of love and affection, but also, of course, age difference. And in that, Morocco is changing fast. And so being born in 1989 is quite different from being born in the early 80s or 1974. But yeah, I would receive a lot of their confession. I was the confidant of everyone, and especially my mom. And I would say, over time, I kind of understood that she also found in this space a safe space to express herself that she couldn't find in friendship or amongst her siblings who were quite different from her. And so quite early on, I picked up an interest in literature and in writing. My mom would, we had a computer, I think, back in 1996, and I would sit in this room, the very room where I received the first copy of Being Other delivered in Morocco. So it was very, very beautiful. And so, yeah, I would write stories, and I would write stories about things that would happen to me and that I needed to make sense of, things that were also not easy, like what felt at the time like a micro-traumatic event. At some point, I was running in the garden and I fell in a hole because there were constructions in our garden, and my entire body was wounded and I was covered in mud and blood. And after taking care of the situation in her best way, which kind of meant that she punished my sister for not caring about me, because I was under her responsibility. She asked me to write a story about it, or write a story about things that would happen at school and such. And so I really loved that approach, and I was also jealous of books that she would spend reading in her little time for herself, those 5-10 minutes before getting a short power nap. I remember her sitting on the couch and browsing through those books or just capturing one page. And I thought for myself, this is the moment I want my mom's attention. And eventually I fell in love with those books. And so I would say this relationship, particularly with my mom, shaped a lot of my perspective on the world. So those were my early years. But even as a teenager, I would sit with her, and for hours we would talk and talk. And she was very she felt like it was a very strong responsibility for me to be aware of my lineage, of my story, of her story, of appreciating the battles and also the big changes in Moroccan culture. Because again, I was in a French school, and in the summer I would go to American school until my dad would have time for us to go on holidays. And then we would travel to Spain. And so it was kind of a bubble that was relatively financially comfortable, had access to knowledge from all over the world and such. And my mom wanted me to know that it was not always like this, and it was not like this for the rest of the world as well, and Morocco, but also that it was beautiful in its own ways, right? So I guess through her conversation with me, she was processing all those changes. At the end of the day, she was born in 1950 in Ezmour, which I eventually had the chance to discover with her like 30 years later, when she finally accepted for me to come with her. And then I understood why she pushed back for so long, because all of her memories were in Rumbles. The Riyadh where she grew up was literally in Rumbles, and this city was not as well taken care of as Rabat, for instance, which is kind of this beacon of bourgeois lifestyle in Morocco and in Africa for that matter. So yeah, I think I that was very much shaped by these conversations. And also, like I said, I was going to a French school, and so all my friends were either expats or children of expat couples or mixed couples. So my very best friends were 2 French Moroccan young boys, and for the longest time I thought I was French Moroccan too, because we would spend our time together and celebrate Christmas together and so on. And so it took a few experiences of understanding, especially reaching the age of puberty, where then a number of rules needed to be applied to protect me, and then I couldn't have my best boys' friends over, and I couldn't spend the night at their place, or my cousins for that matter. So then I kind of understood, okay, well, I have an Arab dad here. It's definitely not the same conversation that my friends are having, my French, German friends, and so on. But that was part of it, just like other components of diversity, which I came to appreciate. My dad was a doctor, and many of his patients were from all over, but also from all over Morocco, and many were Jewish. And so we would be invited into celebrating Jewish celebrations, which was part of my youth. And really, it felt like family to me because we were entirely adopted by them. And in moving to France later on, I kind of understood that not everyone has grown up in this context where it's all about celebrating one's, specific way to cook this or that, and still kind of feeling so much kinship. My dad's patients would come back from Israel with gifts from Israel, so I kind of associated Israel with a place to visit as well at some point, because people that felt like family were going there. And at the same time, of course, I would see in my mom's family in particular, strong affection and not just affection, but like really being hurt by what Palestinians were enduring. And so those components and those influences were part of my upbringing. Just like the closeness to people that were working for us, in Morocco, we have this culture of dada. So each of us in the family grew up with a sort of nanny, but it's not just transactional. It's they're part of the family. And I remember when I moved to France to pursue my studies, I spoke with my dad, and she was like, "Whenever you get married and you have kids, please call me." And it's and then I kind of tried to explain to French friends what the role of dada is, and they would look at this with their very with a certain like in a way that was dismissive, because they couldn't completely understand that families in Morocco would kind of adopt those people that were there from generation to generation. But of course, they had a lot of sacrifices that they were making, and at the same time, they were so grateful to be part of the family because they had their needs covered and their children's needs covered, and so on. So all of this kind of was part of my upbringing, and so I think it's a beautiful concoction and in the best possible way, fusion cuisine of influences that my parents kind of cooked for us, and then we kind of continued cooking for ourselves.
So then what is your earliest memory of being otherized? Because you talk about hitting puberty and not being able to play with your best friends who are boys. In the book, you tell us about, being defiant and having to deal with the reality that you are actually a woman in a patriarchal culture. Tell us about that.
I'd say even before that, I remember my aunties always calling me, "Oh, the little Frenchie," or "the little Brit," because my eldest sister was then, studying abroad, and whenever she'd come back, because we hadn't seen each other in months, she would bring a lot of gifts and outfits. And so I was a little bit of their they had fun kind of making me wear things that looked very British posh and things like this. So I'd show up in family gatherings wearing such things. And my aunties, so my father's sisters would call me this way. But then for me, it felt, and the way it landed was very much, oh, she's different. She has a French accent when she speaks Moroccan Arabic. And then over time, I kind of understood that behind that, there was it wasn't so innocent, the way they called me. They called me in a way that really showed some of their envy and even jealousy. And then over time, I kind of understood that my father, who was the eldest in his family, had also the responsibility to bring up his brothers and sisters, which he did to his best capacity. A lot of them are doctors just like him. They followed his path. But then they had this kind of expectation that he would continue providing, and he had responsibility vis-a-vis us. So it came with that, and of course, as a child, like, it takes a long time to understand. And my mother would confide in me, but she could also not say everything to me because I didn't have the I mean, she wanted to protect me as well, and she wanted me to have the best possible relationships with them and with my cousins. But that's one of the earliest times where I felt othered, as in, oh, she's not legitimately Moroccan. She's a bit different. She obviously has privileged. She's been privileged in that sense, and so she doesn't fully belong, and we'll tokenize her a little bit, and also we'll respect her, not necessarily because of her or bring her affection, but because she's our brother's daughter, and so that I felt acutely. And then later on, like I said, the restriction over being able to be with boys and having to justify and such things, that really was difficult for me, because it was a time where my closest friends in growing up were leaving because their parents had finished their mandate. And so I felt isolated. I felt really lonely. My sisters were also leaving because they had reached an age where they would study abroad. And so I remember around the age of 10 to 14, like it felt really isolating at that time. And it was also a time where then I kind of understood that it was not always so smooth between my parents, and being the confidant of both of them, and mostly my mom, then it's things that are hard to receive. And then there's another thing. My sister Selma, when she was a teenager, started to have a skin disease that was very difficult for her. She started to have eczema, which, she would have rashes, and a lot of people in her high school would either make fun of her or make up stories, things like, oh, it must be AIDS. And she was internalizing a lot, so she was suffering a lot. And then as a result, she, kind of put distance with me. And at the same time, it kind of felt like I had to earn her trust and confidence, which I did over time, but it was a lot of work, and I could sense her pain. And she could not do things anymore like us all together going to hammam, because it was not good for her. And then I started to feel like how the whole family dynamic shifted into finding ways for her to feel safer. So sending her abroad to do those retreats in La Roche-Posay. And then, because she was fighting a lot with my other sister, having her own space. So it started to feel like everyone was, all the resources were going into that end. And it was actually not, at the same time, like it felt so important, but you could feel like it was uneasy for everyone. And then to come back to those aunties, I remember them kind of almost shaming her or pushing her aside. And that felt really tough for me. Like I would sense their judgment over her, how she looked. It's an age when you're 14, 15. In that culture, you just want to be pretty and be appreciated for your beauty. And for me, like it was really, it was hurting me. It was triggering me a lot to sense their judgment and to sense their discomfort around my sister's presence, because I was feeling protective of her at the end of the day, even if sometimes she was tough on me. It was my sister. So all of those things made me feel a sense of being othered. And it escalated over time.
Yes, it certainly escalates, because you've detailed the initial experiences of being othered at the family level, and you go out for a walk, even though you've been told that as a girl child, it's not safe to do so, you're not allowed to do so, and you end up being harassed and threatened.
Mm-hmm. So as a teenager, I was playing a game with my friends. Actually, very early on, way before that game, one day, one of our friends had her parents, I think, forgot to pick her up, or she had a miscommunication with her parents, and her house was very close to school. So I took the lead to say, well, we're a group of 5 girls. We're just going to walk you home and then come back to finish our lunch. It was about, literally crossing the boulevard and then a few streets away. And whenever we did that, actually, we got her home safe. We were walking back, 5 girls. I was in the middle. I was, with my backpack, with my books. And someone came to me with a knife and threatened me, and eventually took or steal my bag. And it was a whole weird situation where everyone started running and I was left behind. And then eventually we got to a school and we explained the situation, and the guardians and the drivers there got upset that we had been harassed, and eventually then my bag got stolen. So they decided to take on them to find that thief and get my bag back. But then we took another risk and got into their cars. Like, in hindsight, that was completely insane. But eventually we found ourselves in this, absurd movie situation where that thief jumped and took a taxi. He left my bag. So that was the first time, and I was not supposed to be there. So I came back to school. I felt so bad about it. And then for months, I would have nightmares about it and I would not feel safe. So it took me a little bit to then also conquer the streets, and I was 12, 13. Friend with whom I had grown up, and she asked me to bring gifts to her guardian. And again, he was very close. I used to take care of my dog a lot, so I just thought, I'll walk my dog, I'll give the gifts to this guardian, and I'll come back home. And it's, I had the awareness that we were in a privileged neighborhood. It's one of the most residential areas in Morocco. So I walked my dog to his house and gave him the gifts, and I walked back and I passed next to her house, and there sat a man and a young man who started threatening me and harassing me, but with the worst threats, like, I will kill you, I will rape you. They sent their very big dog to attack my dog, who, despite being a young German Shepherd, was actually not the size of that other dog, which it felt like a bear. So it was very, very, traumatizing, I guess. And what was more traumatizing is that a lot of people were witnessing the situation, walking on the street, and then eventually, when that finished, they would come to me and say, "She besmeken," like, there's no harm. And then I felt so canceled in the fear that I was feeling, because it was very big. Eventually, what happened is that guardian had decided to come down for some reason, and then he found me there, and then he decided to walk me home as soon as possible. And then as soon as I got home, then my mom was there, and I told her the situation, and I started crying, and it was because it was intense. It was extremely intense. Feeling like you could be beaten on the street. Actually, you could be, and no one would show up for you, and it's your neighborhood. And so that felt like a massive betrayal. Thank God my mom decided to not just acknowledge it, but really make a point for me to understand that there was a sort of justice that to be sought. And so she called my dad, but she had to call my dad, to call him out of his office so that they could go together to the police station and file a complaint. And then I heard very little about it later on. So they explained that the person in question, the young man, had lost his father. And then he was very hard to contain from that time. His mother had a hard time, finding ways to make sure that he would behave properly. But he was eventually called by the police to have a conversation, but just a conversation. And so it's interesting to witness, because now things have changed in Morocco. Actually, a few years ago, I was in Rabat itself, I was out of a medical appointment, walking in the street next to my primary school. And it's an area where there's a number of embassies. And so someone had started following me all throughout, and I kept on telling him, stop following me, but he wouldn't stop. And then I decided to go to the police officer, and I told him, and he called him, and then he intervened at that point, and he asked me, do you want to file a complaint? He was laughing at my behavior because I was literally shaking, like, for me to take that step to say, well, this person has threatened my well-being in the street and my security potentially. And I kind of started to ramble about it, as in the street also belonged to me. I just want him to understand that it belongs to me as much as it belongs to him and to any woman and so on. But I also did not want him to end up in jail for that, So I was kind of like torn between, do I go to the very end of it, or do I take it that it's enough for me that he's been shamed by this police officer or because he did something wrong? And he came up with a stupid excuse like, yeah, I was just looking for directions. Of course, you're going to look for directions and follow someone over blocks and blocks. So anyway, it's interesting to witness because literally the rules have changed, but it changed in Rabat. Whether it's the case in all of Morocco, it's not true. And I travel a bunch. So yeah, it's this, and this is just one of the many instances. I was in the Medina, I was walking there with my best friend. Someone comes to me and whispers in my ears. I was a teenager, and he says, if I catch you, I'll rape you. Things like this. And it's intense, of course. And it breaks my heart also to say that, because over time, you kind of realize, okay, I'm going abroad and I'm studying in great schools, and I'm starting to have this exposure, and a lot of people associate Morocco with me because, they have a bond now, and I kind of have to endorse a sort of ambassadorship for Morocco, which I love. I absolutely love this country, which is why I love for it to be a safer place for women. And then I kind of felt like torn because on the one hand, you're telling a lot of things that are difficult, but it's reality. And on the other hand, people have the expectation for you to kind of be like, well, it's a beautiful place to be, so just go. And felt like also betraying a little bit of this oath of silence, which people like to.
But then I'm interrupting you because those are the Moroccan experiences of othering. You just told us about going to France, where you face even more incidences of othering. The context being, of course, that you go to study and you end up with 5 degrees, Hannah. 5 degrees.
So you call me crazy.
Well, no, I wouldn't call you crazy. I just think it's amazing to have, and then from elite institutions, 5 degrees, and still the othering persists.
That's right. I was born in a family that really valued education. And so whenever I got that scholarship from the French government for excellence, and it was a time that was a difficult time for my family. Like my parents were going through, a lot of grief and loss after my sister passed away. So I sort of felt Selma, yes. So I kind of felt like, this opportunity has been given to me to achieve my dreams. And some of my dreams were actually to study in the US. And eventually I found a way to do that through an exchange program that was organized by Sciences Po. But I just had a very strong appetite for knowledge and education. And I liked the approach that I was finding in Sciences Po with that director, Bruno Latour, who was bringing humanities together with science so that he could shape minds for people to be relevant change makers in the climate action space. So that's one. And then from there, you just continue. I did have the strong appetite. I also had an understanding. It felt like honoring also the desires of my grandmother and great grandmothers, because I was always told by my mom that my grandmother would have loved to go to school, and she wasn't, not just allowed, but it wasn't a thing, So my other grandmother from my dad's side had been to school, but it was so rare. And she also became a school director with her, middle school degree. But it was again so rare in that context. And so for me, it really felt like all these women had been betrayed in their in the recognition of their intelligence, because otherwise they were kind of acknowledged as a source of wisdom and guidance, but they had aspirations, and it just felt to me like the level of stimulation that I got from learning this subject and debating here, and also solving these math equations, and then understanding this biochemistry context and all of that, really. And then, like we had a subject with Bruno Latour that was called Mapping Controversies, and it was adding a layer of understanding of socio-technical controversy. So it really, I felt so thriving there that I just couldn't fathom and accept that some women were deprived from that level of fulfillment. So it was something that was very much in me. And with that, not only had I started working, studying degrees, but I was also working at the same time. Like when I did my dual master's degree, I also studied law and I started working, and I had 2 jobs plus a third one, like it was a teaching assistant. So it started to feel like my resume building it was very honorable. And with that, yes, you kind of come to the workplace and then you realize you're that little, Moroccan girl, so the Maghrebian spark that they appreciate. And at the same time, they would discount you, in like very subtle ways or mean ways. Like they would, they'd see, and I'd say my first managers or bosses could see in me like a grit and aspiration to do more. So they would also put me on the toughest assignments. But when it came to salary negotiation, God forbid that you would ask for what you want. And then it took months and months and months. And at the beginning, I kind of felt like maybe I'm just not as prepared as I should be. So I'm just going to reopen this book of negotiating in a principled approach, the Harvard way, blah, blah, blah. And then I kind of realized, no, these guys are just completely taking advantage of their position and not being fair to me. And the same way that they had not been fair to other women consultants in the team or managers for that matter. So I kind of started to understand what was at play, and without, kind of falling into a sort of victimhood, kind of understanding that I needed to make my way out to actually really progress in my life. Because at the same time, like, it really felt like a trap. I was working so hard, so much. I was neglecting a lot of other aspects of my life, my social life, my romantic life, and so on. And so my mom could tell me, like, you're not happy. And at the same time, I was so triggered by her comments because, does she even understand the difficulties of being an immigrant in this country? Now I look back and I'm like, there's no I should have. Like, I honor every chapter of my life for what they have been. But she's had the clear understanding of what was going on, and I felt trapped in dynamics that were overpowering me and not honoring the person I was.
So you're unfairly compensated at work, and this is a recurring pattern in your professional experiences. Even getting your French citizenship.
Oh, yes, it is an issue. Well, the first thing that people need to know is that it's not a right in France. And I think from the recent event, a lot of people kind of understood what was the level of racism in France. France almost got a fascist government lately. They just got out of it and got another convoluted situation where it's almost ungovernable. But it kind of expressed a strong, perspective from society. And so it is not a right to become French, despite the fact that you meet a number of criteria, things like having gone to French schools, having studied in elite schools, being economically integrated because I had contracts already. Yes, I kind of came across a number of barriers and even situations that were completely absurd. People literally passing on half of my documents to the next department that was supposed to assess my case, and just like a lot of other people in my context, I kind of realized you have to make sure that your application goes in the right hands. And it doesn't mean, bribing or nepotism. It just means that in such administration, there are people that are so blatantly racist that they would make sure that some of the applications that are of high quality would not even be considered. And so, eventually I wrote a recours administratif myself from the adjournment that I received, and then someone who worked for the Conseil d'État made sure that my application was received by the most benevolent hands. And to think that my profile, someone like me who had my education is eventually sponsored by the French government. I had 5 degrees. Multilingual, a francophone and a francophile from very early on, that I would not become French after living about a decade in France or having to go through such troubles. It's kind of disheartening. But that was the case, and eventually now I've been, after I've been naturalized French, it's been 10 years now, and I would say I made the most of that passport. I traveled the world, and I continue to travel the world.
Passport privilege, especially for those of us who come from the global south,
Yeah.
is a reality. You start coming into emergence because you're fighting all these battles: patriarchy, misogyny, racism, discrimination. You're doing everything that society tells us to do, and yet you find yourself being pushed back on account of being a woman. Even your Moroccan identity is questioned in France. And then you tell us about, and unfortunately, with so much going on in the world, we've experienced it in Kenya as well. The terror attacks, Bataclan concert, and the Charlie Hebdo magazine attacks leave an indelible mark on you.
It's true. I think to this day, when I travel to France, I feel a little bit of anxiety from having experienced that time. So I was working full time for a consulting firm when the Charlie Hebdo attacks happened. And, I was, let's say, relatively comfortably living in Paris. I had my apartment, living in Batignolles, having friends. I had gone through quite a bit because, in addition to losing my sister a good 8 years prior to that, my father had passed away in the middle of me completing my master's degree. And so with that, it felt like I had nothing to fall on. Like literally one of the safety nets that I had with the main provider of our family, and a massive source of affection and support, mental support, despite everything else, despite some of the chaos and the depression he was going through himself. But it really felt like for a little bit I was on my own, and so it was, in that sense, a relatively fragile context. And so the Bataclan attacks happened, and that night, I described that night in the book. I was at home and sick, and the next day, the whole weekend was just, everything was frozen and people were completely scared. And I resorted to spending time with one of my best friends, and then I experienced racism in that context too. She would open the door with some of her friends who decided to be together during that time, and she would say, well, oh, hey guys, I brought an Arab, and so this is the moment where I kind of felt like it felt like I did not deserve the same level of empathy as everyone else, whereas I felt fully Parisian. And then from there, a number of other situations, including at work, where a lot of people come to you and try to have explanations. What is Islam? Why is it so violent? And so on and so forth. And I, of course, got burnt out from all of this context, in addition to me just not feeling safe in Paris anymore. I mean, at the end of the day, I had friends of friends who were in the Bataclan, friends of friends, or friends or myself, I had been eating in that restaurant a week prior to the attack, the Vietnamese restaurant. And so it really was heavy. And it also gave license to people to fully express their racism. And I mean, on the one hand, I felt a lot of empathy because it's just very difficult as a person and as a people to experience that, to see, that level of willingness to harm from people that were born and raised in a country. And I could understand how many people also had a hard time understanding that it was a product of segregation, literally segregation, exclusion, and violence breeds violence. But at the same time, there were points where I, internally would lose my patience because I wanted to cry out loud and say, well, don't you see that you're also perpetuating this culture of elite versus everyone else? I would hear jokes all the time about people from the suburb and so on and so forth, and their needs to really
And within
address.
the French context, the suburbs are really where the marginalized, under-resourced neighborhoods are,
Yeah. And
as opposed to other parts of the world where the suburbs are leafy
right.
and privileged.
Right. And to put it bluntly, this is exactly where Arabs and Black people live. And so a lot of people would also regret that even the police would not be able to be there. But it's essentially third and fourth generation of immigrants that were marginalized over time. And when you look at their family's history, I mean, you're kind of understanding they never were supported into embracing the French culture at its best. And so, even myself, to be fair, even myself growing up in Morocco and in that context, the Zmegri never had a good reputation because they would come back over the summer, kind of colonize the beaches and behave in an improper way. Or even when they wouldn't do that, they would go to rural areas and they would get women impregnated because women would think, oh, I'm finally getting my passport out of Morocco. And eventually, and you'd see, I remember looking at data and seeing peaks of natality, or and those women were put in the toughest situations because then they were not legitimately married, they were abandoned. Legally speaking, it puts them at risk because they were solo, like they were mothering solo. So it was a whole catastrophe. So they never had a good reputation to start with. But then when I attended Sciences Po, and the director of Sciences Po had this beautiful vision of engaging with people from the suburb, with the Convention ZEP and like specific kind of like exams and things like this. Then I actually have peers from Sciences Po who became extremely prolific entrepreneurs, creating tons of jobs, raising beautiful, doing beautiful raises and creating beautiful startups and things like this, or becoming champions, like boxing champions and things like that. And I'm so proud of them. And I'm also so grateful that I had the opportunity to shift my mind around it and understand that there's talent everywhere. Of course, there's talent everywhere. And it's talent that is calling for support and care and attention, which a lot of people are not finding in such areas.
Hanae, the premise of our conversation is responsible, transformative, courageous leadership. And the name of this podcast is Fearless. Fear comes up several times in your book.
Mm-hmm.
What do you fear, Hanae?
It's such a good question because I feel more and more fearless, to be honest with Frank. I feel fearless in traveling the world and meeting people and also sharing my story, because it does take courage to kind of show yourself out there and be open to criticism or even indifference for that matter, which is even harsher. What I fear, I'd say I accept change more and better, but I would fear that my closest ones would be hurt, or that I would lose them. So of course, I would fear certain impediment into my thriving. Right now I feel like in such a flow. There's a lot more to do. I'm working towards bringing to life a program for Black and Indigenous and women of color founders in health and climate and education, and that needs funding. And I would fear that I would not get that support, or that my timeline would shift, or that I would fall kind of like off my track. I have those fears sometimes, and I've had to kind of come to terms with it that summer. I have fears that I would not be met in the love I give. The last 10 years of my life have been a lot of trials and errors, let's say, on the romantic level. And I've been told so many times, and I know a lot of it is not true, that, oh, you cannot show up with that level of strength, or you're a strong woman. And I've been told those lies by even people that are so close to me, that I love so much, and that hurts. And then I kind of understand that we're not at the same level of awareness, and we don't see the things the same way, but it comes from a place of love tainted with fear. So forgive. But I have those fears, of course. I have the fear that, again, I would kind of get off track because with that now, it feels like with this book and some of my endeavors, I met so many promises to myself, and I also made so many promises to the world. And so imagine if for any good or wrong, bad reason, I would kind of, not being able to go to the next step. I have those fears, of course.
There's a line in your book in which you say, and I quote, "So perhaps being born an Arab Muslim woman is not as adverse a condition as initially thought." And you talk about the beauty and power of being an outsider, Hanae. What was your process of transforming the adverse experiences you've told us about into strength and beauty?
Mm-hmm. Dwak, I remember when I was a teenager, one of my sister's friends, she was much older than us, and I used to call her kind of like a godmother to me. She was from La Réunion. She had experienced herself racism in going to France, and like with a lot of conversations that I've had with her, I understood better the French context, even beyond my, going to school and own experience. And at the time, we were kind of counting, we would make jokes about, oh, when you start, people start at that line, but then you come from the Maghreb and you start here, and you come, you're born as a woman and you start even below, and things like this. And then you have personal trauma and you start even below, and then you don't have your family full support behind you for certain projects and you start below, and things like this. And now I'm kind of like, oh no, God, no. All these experiences that I've had to digest, make sense of, they, I meditate every morning and every night, and I kind of feel how I've made some, magic with it, like energy with it. And it's not, when I wake up in the morning, I wake up with enthusiasm, curiosity, and also the confidence that I look back and I say, well, I built not only one startup, but two startups at the same time that were eventually very successful with no one backing myself, like in terms of finances. I had this boldness and it worked. And then I worked in East Africa and I traveled to 46 countries, and all of this I made for myself, right? And so, this book is out, and then I have poetry, and then I have another book, and then things like this. And so I'm basking in the joy of all those things that I've become and that I was able to achieve, and also the balance that I found. Because right now it's also this, the being a woman is for me like an energy that overflows, and I'm finding a lot of gratitude in being able to experience the world in a way that is absolutely not hurting, but it's actually deep enough and subtle enough and wide enough. And so I find it as a gift. And the other thing when it comes to my lineage is that every time I set an intention for a project, be it small or big, it feels like I'm calling literally my ancestors to push with me. And I feel their support, and they're so proud of me. And a lot of them now, I cannot have like a conversation like I'm having with you. It's more of a prayer. But I feel their alignment. And in that sense, I feel very much on my lane.
You talk about one of the tools you've used, because right now you've shared that you've shared the other side of adversity, which is joy, gratitude, practices you use such as meditation, morning and night. You told us about circles, Harapi circle and ayahuasca, in Peru. How did those experiences of medicine circles, alternative practices, especially for those of us who ascribe, I'm Christian, ascribe to monotheistic religions like Judaism, Islam, or Christianity?
Thank you for this question. Yes, expanding my view and an appreciation of other practices way beyond, Islam. And I was born in a rather liberal, secular family anyway. So like I told you before, I would, celebrate all celebrations. It's been a step though, because I was also born into a context where some of the practices that do still exist in Morocco of are seen as sorcellery and witchery and are not acceptable. And so for me to open up to actual, ancestral knowledge that is passed on from one master to another, and we have that a little bit in Morocco with music. The Gnawa culture is very much like you get into trance, and with trance you kind of connect to source, and like it's over meditation, and it's done as a collective, and it is a celebration, and all goes through it, the full spectrum of human experience, and a lot of people also get that from listening to prayers. But I had the curiosity to discover Latin America, and then eventually had the privilege to sit in a circle with an elder, and she conducted an ayahuasca ceremony. And it was a time where I had so many questions. I was leaving Paris. I was also out of a significant relationship. I was very much hurting, and that whole journey made me feel so connected to nature, to God, to my creative power. Like it felt, and also, with that comes a lot of grieving. Like I also went through stages, and I've felt my, the parting of my father, the parting of my sister, and so on. And so it was the first kind of journey, and I've had the opportunity to do a few more in certain circles that felt safe and that felt also honoring the gravitas also, and the lineage. So it was always passed on from people that had a strong connection to this heritage, rather than just consume, because you also have that, I'm based in Portugal, and I can tell you a lot of people do all sorts of things in Portugal, to and sometimes that feels a little bit consumerist. And so my point was always to kind of feel as connected as possible to people that had learned from masters and were close to that lineage. But I would say I'm very privileged. I'm back from Hawaii, and not that I sat in a circle or did a plant medicine journey there, but I was staying with a community that is called the Nation of Hawaii, and the leader, Uncle Bumpy, is known as one of the heirs of Kamehameha, the last king of Hawaii. And they all work towards the recognition of the sovereignty of the land of Hawaii, but also passing on the ancestral knowledge around the aloha spirit. And it is real, and it is palpable. And we were walking on that land, because literally doing work on the land, and he started with a prayer, a pule, to call in the ancestors and to ask them for their permission for us to be on that land. And that level of reverence and sacredness is for me so key. And so I embrace that fully, and I'm very grateful. And I also see, when I'm in places where it's lacking, the level of disconnect. And so, right now I'm in Canada, and I appreciate that Canada had made a strong effort to include, land acknowledgement. For instance, when you go on any website, when you attend any ceremony, there's a land acknowledgement. I would say we can go much deeper and really embrace what that level of spirituality can bring to us in terms of interconnectedness, respect, and achieving progress as a collective.
So look, you and I know each other through the Responsible Leaders Network. We also have another context in common, the Policy Center for the New South, where you are an emerging leader. You also have had various other leadership experiences, leadership communities that you belong to. In your book, you talk about accountable leadership.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? And how does this serve us in the current times that we're in?
Yes. We belong to that group called Responsible Leaders, and it's such a big ambition, right? And I think the last years, so many of us were shaken by big situations where it felt like we were not showing up fully as a group, when it comes to the genocide going on in Palestine, for instance. As a group, we were not able to support even some of us that are there in Gaza. So we fell short in that sense. And it's really hard sometimes to kind of still embrace that label. With that said, many of those people are doing amazing things for many other causes, and it's still very useful of a community, just like the other communities of leadership. And I would say beyond those constructed groups where there are foundations behind and curation behind and so on, a lot of other communities of care and practice emerge because we humans need such context, and I believe in collective intelligence, and I see leadership emerge all the time in such contexts where people care about the well-being of others, and then they would push forward an approach. When it comes to responsible leadership, at times we see people in office or in positions of power.
But I'm asking you about accountable leadership.
Yes, precisely. So they have a certain responsibility, and the level of accountability is not always met, because they would have strategies, like I'm talking about CEOs and some people in office, and we're in 2024. There's 70 elections going on. You and I talked about Kenya last time, and some of the leaders in the African continent that, instead of understanding that they have a responsibility to care and for the well-being and security of their people, they would actually harass them and kill them if they would not be so inclined to still participate in the big lies that they make. So we see it all, like there's a full spectrum. And so what I'm saying is that there are some people, or rather, let me say it this way. The level of accountability and comes to value alignment, when it comes to capacity to implement, are the two criteria for people embracing the responsibility that they have. So right now, when I see, I'm at a place where I can't be impressed by any sort of label or position. I'm only impressed by the level of alignment that I feel and the level of truth that I hear. And the good thing is that there are more and more tools now for many people to actually appreciate, in addition to their own intuition and sense of and like grids of understanding what's at play. But for me, what we need to teach to everyone from day one at school and even prior to that, and within families, is being accountable to oneself and to everyone else. Being accountable to oneself means not betraying the person you are. And so that means, if you have an interest in or a passion, or you have this level or this part of you that needs to be expressed, you need to be accountable to it. And accountability is the ultimate love language. There's this book called the Love Languages, and a lot of people now talk about it. But for me, being accountable to who you need to be, who you aspire to be, and as a friend, calling your friend to say, you had this dream at some point and it was so you. So what happened to it? You had this aspiration. What happened to it? How can we hold you in embracing it? Or, was it the previous you and it's all fine? And do you have other dreams now? That's for me the holding grid that we need to embrace now.
Your book is interesting because you provide us with exercises. And I want to read something from your accountability letter to yourself, which you shared. And you say, being accountable to these women, the women that you talk about in the book, and their aspirations is a constant driving force for me. It reminds me of the impact I have, the potential to make, and the responsibility I have to uplift their voices. I am committed to supporting them in any way I can, whether through sharing their stories, advocating for their needs, or creating opportunities for their growth and empowerment. And so as we close, Hanae, I'm going to modify some of the questions that I typically would ask. What would you like the world to be accountable for?
I like the word to be accountable for justice, equal justice. And that means everyone's feeling safe and loved and cared for. And that means, it has material meaning, as in everyone being housed, everyone being having access to decent job opportunities, and not just job opportunities, but also aligned job opportunities that are also enhancing their gifts and taking advantages of all their contributions, right? And having access to wellness and health and opportunities to grow, and having access to tools to really enhance their immediate relationships. And one of those relationships, which is one of the essential ones, is relationship to nature. And so we're at a critical time. I really want the world to be held accountable for how we talk to nature, converse with nature, take from nature, give back to nature. We're at a place of worrisome imbalance. And I want everyone to feel not just a daunting responsibility, but an enthusiastic desire to do better together.
And what lessons can we take from your experiences, Hanae, in creating a world where we do better together?
Mm-hmm. I'd say perhaps the invitation is definitely to do the inner work, and it can show in so different ways. I offer these exercises that were useful for me, and some of them I came up with while writing the book, because it felt like, okay, well, I wish I knew that. And I wish I knew that in that playful manner. And, if I had to write the book again, maybe in the next edition, maybe I would, tweak things again, because creativity is a key value for me. And so that's the other invitation, like really embrace your creativity and give it space and give it a format and a purpose, and work towards alignment. So that's the other invitation. And the other thing that I want to share through, with my book and this work towards self-expression and embracing that curiosity also for the world. I'm happily named a notorious migrant, and I'm happily a traveler, and and as much as sometimes it can be hard, it can be it's a lot of headache and work, and I want to have more support, but I really encourage people to have this curiosity. It doesn't mean going as far as Hawaii, and because it's not always possible, but it means having the curiosity for your neighbor and understanding their story and the richness that comes with it.
Our time has come to an end. And so, Hanae Bezad, thank you so very much for writing this book, Being Other, the beauty and power of being an outsider. I'd also like to thank you for appearing on the podcast, Fearless. Thank you, Hanae.
Thank you, Edouard, for the work you did.